Well, thank you everyone for joining our panel. I'm just going to introduce our lovely moderator, who is Nadya Tannous. Nadya is a passionate community organizer and writer, born and raised in the Bay Area with a focus on refugee rights, transitional justice, youth education, and intercommunity empowerment. She's a board member of the Palestinian Youth Movement, USA, and core member of the Ghassan Kanafani Resistance Arts Scholarship Committee. Nadya holds a master's in science in refugee and forced migration studies from the University of Oxford and a BA in anthropology and global information and social enterprise studies from UC Santa Cruz. She is an editor of the Peñasco Vignette Collective. Thank you so much, Nadya.
Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening. We're really doing an amazing feat. يعطيكم العافية Power Rights Festival. This has been an incredible series of programming, and I know it expands across many different time zones. Thank you all so much for being here today with us. I'm very, very excited about this panel. And, you know, architects of our narrative, why did we name it that? Firstly, this panel is inspired by the Ghassan Kanafani Resistance Arts Scholarship, which is in its 5th year of production. We are creating the anthology as we speak, and the theme this year is Letters to Mustafa, which is, of course, from the very famous letter from Gaza, from Kanafani's own work. And we asked young writers to emulate pieces of the theme's longing and resistance through sacrifice, and really talking about what it means to fight for Palestine, to be engaged in our national struggle, what personal sacrifice in the face of liberation looks like. There are many, many things that came up. Maybe we'll even talk about it during the panel. But what was important, something that we drew out, of course, and what we try to do in every anthology, is to really honor Kanafani's legacy as somebody who took individual Palestinian experience and wove that into a collective narrative. He made the memories of Nakba into a demand for return. And so I think we are indebted to him for that, but indeed his work also lives on, and that spirit lives on through us as young writers, as young Palestinians who are, in the case of the members of this panel and the folks who do submit to the scholarship, are in exile and who live in diaspora, but we are also facing home, which is Palestine. And so we know that although we are over 73 years in exile, our narratives actually don't just stop at Nakba. They don't just stop at the events of 1967 and the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan and the entrenchment of Jerusalem, right? They don't just stop at our suffering in the refugee camps throughout the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the onslaughts and the protracted, waves of exile, right? We continue them. So we are not a community frozen in time. We really believe that it is our duty to construct our own narratives, to continue to comment on our political conditions and on our aspirations. Who are we to tell these stories? And so truly, this is not just a slogan or a title of the panel. Architects of Our Narrative talks about the responsibility, maybe the burden, the desire, the real presence of our crafting of who we are, and of carrying the narratives of our grandparents and our great-grandparents, in some cases, our parents and ourselves, onto the next generation, and continue to form it as a rallying cry for our demands, which are return, liberation, dignity. and we won't settle for anything less. And so I think that's important also to tell the emotional journey and indeed our own stories through that, because this movement is about also not just land, it's its people. We are its people. So I'm really pleased to be here, and I want to introduce my fellow panelists. And let's see, first, I'll just refer to them in the ways that they came to the scholarship, and then I'll read their full bios as we go. So first, we have Maison Granny, who was a contributor of the 2019 anthology Knocking on the Doors of Jerusalem with her piece, Mama, I Don't Know. And she is actually the second place winner of the 2020 anthology, which is coming up in Letters to Mustafa. And her two pieces, Teta Loves Pomegranates and Rubble, won her this designation. So we're extremely proud of you, Maysam. It's so heartening to see folks apply in the past and then apply again and just grow and be recognized for your work. So I'm really excited to hear more from you. And then we have Mohammed al-Kurd, who was a contributor in the 2017 anthology, I Sew the Vacancy into a Home, with his pieces Palestinian Math 101. We discussed more than just sitcoms. This is Why We Dance, Bulldozers Undoing God, A Love Letter from Palestine, Anything But the Usual. And then he's also a contributor in this upcoming anthology with his pieces My Grandmother, Icon of Palestinian Resilience, and The Biggest Punchline of All Time. And last but certainly not least, we have Voulette Hattar, who was the third place winner of the 2017 anthology, I Sew the Vacancy into a Home, with her pieces The Long Way, Untitled, Atlas, or a Guide on How to Leave Home, Bush, and Diaspora Oblivion. So these are these amazing writers, and their pieces, some of our pieces are available for download, and you can put it into your digital swag bag. And so please do go ahead and download them. Thank you so much for the Arabic translation or the English translation in both cases to make them accessible to our communities. I'm actually going to stop talking and I'll do the bios a little bit later because I want folks to really hear from you all. So maybe we can start with opening remarks and just kind of beginning our conversation around the first question, like what is the purpose of storytelling and writing narratives? Why do you write? And I'll start with you, Maysam.
Thank you, Nadya. That was such beautiful introductions, and I'm super honored to be on this panel with everybody, and love like the work of everyone on this panel. And so this is just, my heart is so happy, my little Palestinian heart. But I guess for that first question of the purpose of storytelling, I think specifically for us as Palestinians, like simply put, it is vital that we, obviously write and keep our stories alive. Otherwise, we don't want the colonizers' narrative to win, if you know what I'm saying. And it's vital because as Palestinians, as displaced peoples, as myself, as someone in the diaspora, there's so much memory and so many stories that are kept in secrecy, and to be kind of a part of that generation that is starting to unearth those stories, with or without the permission of our of her grandparents' generation or our parents' generation. It's important that we keep those things alive to keep our collective narratives and our collective peoples alive. So for me, as someone who is like technically very much severed from my original land base and severed from many of my matriarchs, severed from my knowledge carriers, who are all based in Lebanon right now, in Beirut, Bil Mukhayyam, Burj al Barajneh, and different other parts of the world. A lot of the writing I've done has been to kind of understand and honor, simply put. So to understand, you know, the unspeakable, whether that is moments and things in life that are unspeakable, whether that's trauma or moments of beauty, of being someone who is Palestinian, of being someone who was born and raised in downtown Toronto as well. You know, to honor these knowledge carriers, to honor those who came before me and those who will come after, inshallah. Honor the generations of Palestinians displaced and uprooted, and to honor diaspora kids like me, honestly, who grew up in broken homes, with severed kinship ties, with split tongues, you know, young Muslims like me who also grew up learning surahs from the Quran, mostly orally, right? I learned everything through recitation. I didn't learn how to read Arabic until much later, and I'm still, you know, pretty beginner level. So that plays a lot into why I do my writing through spoken word poetry, I think, as well. And to honor diaspora kids with survivor's guilt, I think, you know, a lot of our cousins are back home, still in the camps. My cousins in Lebanon, you know, survived that terrible explosion in August, right? And that just put me in a pit of that survivor's guilt, right? And so to write to honor that, to write to honor, to understand systems of oppression, to understand, you know, this odd predicament of being someone who is intergenerationally displaced from our original land bases through colonialism and are now living on other indigenous people's lands, right? Because of capitalism and colonialism, we're severed from land-based knowledges. And so to write to understand that and to reclaim that is really what I want to do. And to write for my younger self, to understand the things that I often couldn't, because of this type of displacement. To feel seen and witnessed is something that I'm really, you know, wanting to do, and hopefully, you know, others will feel seen and witnessed in the process. So that's my long-winded answer. Thanks for asking. I'll pass it on to someone else now.
I can go next. I just want to say I'm very honored and grateful to be on this panel and to be a part of this conversation. I feel that so much, like the title of this panel, Architects of Our Narrative, is so intertwined with what the purpose of storytelling and writing is, for me, and also why I write too. And I was thinking about this question and thinking about, what does it mean to be architects of a narrative, or what does it mean to tell a story? And I think, like, I was just thinking about how, as Palestinians, like, and also specifically as like a Palestinian who grew up in the diaspora also, is that I feel very separated from my history, separated from the stories of my grandparents, of my family, and that writing allows me to retell these stories, to kind of give myself back this history, and to define it for myself. I feel that, like, being denied this history, like, storytelling gives us the way to kind of give us back an agency over, you know, telling us our own stories. So I feel like it's a way to articulate, you know, our conditions, or the conditions of our families, the conditions of our history, to understand our place within that. And not only, I feel like, is it a way to articulate our conditions and articulate, you know, this history. As you were saying, Nadya, it goes more beyond that too, beyond just like retelling the stories of Nakba, and giving those stories back to ourselves, and giving those stories the space to be heard and, you know, validated. But they also, like, writing can construct and create something new, right? Like, I was thinking about this question and thinking about how, like, I used to love reading so much. Like, I loved reading fantasy books when I was young, like Harry Potter, Aragon, Hunger Games, all that. I like loved reading when I was younger, and it would be like I would lock myself in the bathroom or my parents' closet, and I would read a book for hours, and I would be so like engrossed, like so within that book, right? Like it would become real for me. Like even when the book ended, I would feel like the characters, like I would be sad that this is not a world that it felt like reality came back, right? Like it felt like I was so within this world that was inside the book, so like a part of these characters' lives that I knew them. I felt like I knew them, you know? And that's what writing does, right? It doesn't just construct or create a world, it makes you believe in it. It makes you believe in these new realities. It makes you believe in, you know, these things that are, you know, like words and poetry is not just a recounting or a retelling, but it's a conduit of something that's not available. This is, I think, in a tweet that I saw earlier, but it's not available in the everyday. It's something that it creates these new things that haven't existed before, allows us the agency to create these things, and not just create them, but to believe in their existence, and to share kind of that vision and that world through our words. So for me, I feel like the purpose of writing is both the recounting and retelling of these stories and histories, and also a kind of forward-looking construction, creation of, you know, our narratives, past, present, and future. So yeah, thank you.
I'm very happy to be on this panel today with you. Thank you, and thank you to Palestine Writes for having me. Similarly to everybody else, I started writing and I write today because I believe in the mainstream, the narrative of the Palestinian people is either incredibly misrepresented or super diluted to fit liberal standards, like benign standards of acceptance and solidarity. For example, I grew up in Jerusalem. I was born and raised in Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah, and our house, my family's home, half of it was taken by Israeli settlers and soldiers in 2000 years, and a bunch of our neighbors' houses. And I spent my teenage and adolescent years, although there's so much tragedy and, you know, wrongdoing going on, I spent so much of my teenage years watching my mother and grandmother and aunts and women of the neighborhood like actively resist what is going on the ground. Yet the literature, especially English literature about Palestinian women, did not match. They were either super vilified or super diluted and made into weak victims. So I wanted to write about my grandmother, and that's why I started writing. And now as I'm growing up and walking into my adulthood, I notice a sincere responsibility to write affirmatively, assertively, to kind of kick our feet up on the discourse of Palestine and say, this is what we want, this is what we write about, because I feel, especially in mainstream English literature, Palestinians have been shrunken down. And so I have full plans to like infiltrate the mainstream and to discuss Palestine in the mainstream in a loud way, in a loud rhetoric, as opposed to weakening and smalling ourselves to be accepted ultimately. Yeah, and I think a lot of that also comes from my eagerness to address language. As a writer, I feel that Palestine is written about in a way that is kind of misconceived, and it won't go very far. I'll talk about my own experience. For example, Israeli courts have ruled to displace us from our homes, which is something that is actually happening in Sheikh Jarrah today. That might happen any moment for 12 families. And everybody that's been reporting on it has been saying that it's an eviction just because it falls in line with the Israeli judicial system. And there's so much heft in that word eviction because it's not eviction, it's land theft, right? And if we as writers are unable to engage critically with those systems of oppression, like the Israeli judicial system that was built by and for Israeli settlers, if we are unable to unveil them and call them as they are, talk about them explicitly, then I don't think we can move forward. So that is why I write, because we need to actually say the truth.
Yeah. It's the content of what you all have said and the nafs, the soul of it is so jolting. And I think I want to give you all space to respond to back to each other. But Mohammed, the last thing you said about writing from your own experience, you know, we just talked about why do you write? I know when we thought about the flow of this, we we're thinking like, how do you write? Like, what is your personal trajectory of becoming a writer? You know, your personal story of finding the courage to write and to share your writings, because there's so much feeling, there's so much tumultuousness, and I think adversity to Palestinian stories. I don't want to say the Palestinian story because it's very flattening, and in our unity, we have the opportunity to also be true about who we are, right? A people with multiple experiences, which I think is the hard part of living in exile. You spoke to this, Maysam, and V, of being, you know, away from your people and thinking, you know, as I know I did growing up, am I Palestinian enough? Is this my narrative? Can I own this? Can I comment on this? You know, I'm not my cousins, I'm not my dad, I'm not, you know, so, but I'm myself, right? We are part of the Palestinian experience. And I know, you know, through my politicization, through the Palestinian youth movement, and just as I also get older, you know, walk in my shoes or walk into adulthood, as you said, Mohammed, you realize, right, we can reaffirm the violence that was done to us if we're not careful, right? Oslo fragmented us, right? And if I'm saying, am I authentic enough to be Palestinian? Am I authentic? Am I myself? Am I here enough? It's so disempowering, and it reaffirms their language. Of course I'm Palestinian. Of course we're Palestinian. Any child born anywhere who is Palestinian can own our struggle. And I, you know, I don't mean own in a patronizing way. I mean to become part of it, to entrench ourselves within it, to have it teach us, for us to inform it. This is ours to build. So I think, you know, there's that setting and the why and the external, but internally, how do you write? How do you sort through this stuff to produce narratives? It's such a personal thing. How do you get it out? How do you write it? How do you go through the process of sharing it? And I think I also ask this for folks who may be here watching and engaging with us. You know, they might see themselves in these stories because it's hard. It's not easy to write. It's not easy to put these things into words. So how do you do it? Maysam, I might start with you again.
Yes, sorry. That is those words that you just shared, Nadia. I needed a minute to take it in, I think, before I clicked the unmute button. But I think, you know, you're right. Writing isn't an easy thing to do. And I think, you know, a lot of my own writing came from a place, as I was saying earlier, of trying to understand certain things that were unspeakable. And when I talk about these things, I think in specific, you know, understanding family dynamics and understanding trauma and understanding intimate stories between, you know, mama and teta and khalton and how you know, I've watched my matriarchs over the years, over the span of my 22 years on this earth, how I've seen that all intertwine itself, you know, and that's a difficult thing to do. And I know, you know, in our conversations before this panel, we talked a little bit about kind of the like ethical, moral implications that come with writing about these stories too. And in specific, I think about, you know, a lot of my poetry, you know, uses my mother as a muse, right? My mama, she's everything to me. And you know, but how much, you know, what is my responsibility in telling that story, you know? In that poem that I got into the anthology in 2019, I talk about this a lot, about how do I honor my mom, and how do I, you know, tell a story that isn't directly mine, but was passed down to me in some ways. You know, I am a product of her story, of her refugee story, of her, you know, story being displaced, and also never seeing Palestine. My mom has never been. And understanding that life, how much of a right do I have to tell that story, right? And so I think that's something that has always, you know, sat in the pit of my stomach. How much of a right do I have to tell certain stories when it comes to regards of family and relationships? Also, I wanted to talk a little bit about, I think, the nature of writing what is called, you know, the better story. So I don't know if anyone is familiar with Dina Georges and her work, but she talks a lot about, you know, writing as a human response to histories of injury, right? As they provide, you know, an avenue for kind of a consolate, like comfort to pain that has happened to a community or to a people. And, you know, writing for the sake of collective survival. You know, I'm guilty of doing what Dina Georges describes as, you know, naturalizing a resistance, because it provides us with comfort for, you know, the ways that colonialism has dehumanized us as Palestinian peoples. And just writing about resistance in specific is something that I struggle with too, because, you know, resistance isn't an easy thing to do. It's painful. It's, in reality, it's very tragic. And so to write about resistance in a way that is also ethically and morally, you know, aligned to our values as a people is difficult, right? How do we not romanticize that? How do we, you know, tell the story as honestly as we can? And, you know, I would say a lot of writers who are, you know, a part of this festival have inspired me to learn how to write about difficult stories, to learn about how to write around what's quote unquote the better story in writing about trauma. One of which is Halalian, who I admire greatly. You know, she has taught me a lot about the necessity for vulnerability in your writing, and vulnerability and rawness as a human need that allows for a very transformative experience for people who are listening to a story to feel witnessed, right? Even in our most painful moments. And so, yeah, it's a really, really hard, I think, tightrope to walk across as a writer, as someone who loves to write, as someone who loves poetry, to balance all of these things. But I'm gonna let someone else take the floor.
I grew up similar to Maysam, writing about my family members, but I also grew up with my mom as a poet, and even as a 5-year-old, my mother would spend mornings just reading poetry at me and saying, "What do you think of this?" And we used to play a game where me and her, or her and my dad, would identify which lines would come back from the newspaper censored, because, you know, Al-Quds newspaper was had to answer to the Israeli military censor. So poetry has always been second nature to me, if not first nature. My family kind of speaks in poetics, so I don't have many of those questions that new writers have about their right to write. And if I were to give advice to them, I would just say, just write. Like, do not get caught up in those questions about the righteousness of your word. Do not get caught up in those questions, because our narratives are already hijacked. Our narratives are already misrepresented and small and diluted and shrunken. So just write, because non-Palestinians do not consider all these questions before writing. White people do not consider all these questions before writing. And we know that most of the literature in English written about Palestine is by white authors. So we need not to be caught up in those questions. Obviously, it's a huge responsibility to write about the Palestinian cause, but it's only going to take you one weekend to sit down and like identify all the tropes in writing about Palestine and put them in a Word document and say, I'm never going to do this again. I'm never going to make trauma porn about women and children again. And that's it, just move on, because we're all going to make mistakes as Palestinian writers, and we're all going to improve. And we need not to bully ourselves into those questions that most of white authors writing about Palestine do not bully themselves with. So this brings me to my second point, which is, if I were to give advice to someone, I would just say be delusional. I started writing poems when I was like 8 or 11, and I would post them. I would post like the most terrible typo infested, grammatically incorrect poems in English on Facebook when I was 13. And all these people from Indonesia would be like, wow, amazing. And people were really supportive of me, even though the poetry was not that good, in my opinion. And that made me grow. And so I would say another thing you should do, I know that writing is very personal and very vulnerable, and oftentimes it feels like you're revealing too much about yourself, but do find, even if it's a small circle, do find people to share it with. Because if people are not engaging critically with your work and actually pointing fingers at holes in your writing, you're never going to get better. I understand that as Palestinian writers, we are hurdled and burdened with the responsibility about writing about such a misled and misrepresented cause. However, we also need to understand that we have a path ahead of us, and we cannot waste all of our time just thinking about the righteousness of our words or the best way we could be saying things. We should be writing, and this is a marathon. We should be writing all the time and constantly growing and constantly challenging. And yeah, this is a marathon. This is one of the ways, this is one of the front lines. Writing and literature is one of the front lines we can achieve our goal of liberation. It's not the only front line, it's not the sole one, but it's one of them. So we need to be running. Yeah, I'm sorry, that was really long. I'm gonna pass it.
Yes, thank you so much, Mohammed and Maysam. Your words are very powerful, and I feel like I resonate a lot with what you're saying. And I think specifically Maysam, I feel like I'm coming from a similar place with my writing too, is that I think I've struggled a lot too with that feeling of like, you know, both my parents were born and raised in Jordan. I was born in Jordan, moved to the US when I was like 1 year old. So all I remember is like living in Michigan and in Southern California. And that my mother's parents like fled the Nakba. And that's kind of like, my writing has kind of centered around like my grandparents' experience, right? And so I feel that a lot of times I think like, what authority do I have to write these stories, to perform them, to put my name on them, you know, that it feels like, and I think a lot of times too, like as through poetry, it's kind of like, sometimes I feel as a romanticization. And it kind of makes these like very painful stories beautiful and digestible, which I think is dangerous. And especially as like, you know, that this is not like my story either. It is my story. It's something that's been passed down to me, but it's not something I've directly experienced. So I feel like the way that I see like the way that I've kind of like seen my writing like shift in some ways, especially as a performer, is to try and make it more like confrontational and more like kind of to make people feel like some sort of uncomfortableness. Because I think sometimes like the metaphors of poetry and like the aesthetics of poetry make it so that it's very so that it romanticizes and so that it aestheticizes. But I think that's one of the ways I found. But yeah, I think I've struggled a lot with this idea of like, I don't know if I have like the right to say these stories or to perform them. And kind of my personal like journey with writing is that it's always been something that I've kind of just like written for myself. I mean, for a long time, I started writing when I was young. Sometimes I would write like I would write about my family members too, and like give it to them for like birthdays, and then they would post it on Facebook. And then oh, and then I had like a blog, like a Tumblr, where I put my name under an alias and then would post all my poetry. And then I started sharing, actually my first semester, a little bit of my poetry with one of my closest friends, my first semester in university. And she was an organizer actually with Students for Justice in Palestine. And she kept telling me to like be involved. And I was like, yeah, well, I'm just like very busy right now. And then I was taking a shower actually, and she called me, and then she told me that like she shared my poetry with the board of SJP, and that I was on speakerphone with them, and that they want me to perform for their resistance through art event that was part of Palestine Solidarity Week. And I was like, I've never shared I was like, you're one of the first people that I've shared my poetry with, and you shared it with others. At first I was mad, but then it kind of pushed me into being more like out there and performing. And I feel like once I did that, I just realized how powerful it is to share these words. Like, I feel like, I don't know, like how it inspires people and how it builds community. And I think that was something that I really like, it was missing when I was just keeping my poetry to myself and like just writing it for myself or sharing it with one other person. And I think it just really like helped me see my poetry and my words in a different way and for a different purpose than just like trying to narrate like my own feelings and what's going on within me. And so then I feel like since that, I feel like I started getting more involved with SJP after that. And so I feel like poetry, writing, and like organizing has kind of been always like hand in hand with each other, has been really a part of like my process, and the way that I write also is like a lot of it I have written for like protests or rallies, or when like organizations or people ask me to like perform at events or at protests. And so I feel that like my poetry and like poetry and organizing have always kind of been like intertwined for me and like a part of my process. Yeah, I think I answered the question.
Yeah, truly. I mean, seeing you perform your pieces, I think that's even how I met you, actually. I saw you performing on campus, and I was like, wow, she is incredible. I really love how each of you come to this in a slightly different but connected way. I know that we have like, I don't know, some of the things just to pull out are, you know, process, being really intentional and specific with our words when others are not, right? The idea you said, Mohammed, of it's not eviction, it's land theft, like call it what it is, right? Or what is the process of writing these things and going through your own, you know, I don't know, coming to like what you said, Maysam, about do I have permission to write my family's own stories? And VU commented on that, all of you did, like, whose stories am I telling? And I think it's something where we must write the truth of our experience, and we must be true to our experiences, but also honor the fact that we come from a lineage. We are not individual floating people and souls. We are part of a lineage, right? The writers before us, the writers after us, the Palestinians before us, the Palestinians here, the Palestinians after us. And I think even for myself, I've always written for myself since I was very, very young. I used to wake up and write scraps of paper, but most of my poetry, most of my short stories are just sitting in a file. They're just for me. And I remember before going to Rawi, the Summer Institute last year, shout out to all of you who put that together. I hadn't really published very much. And somebody said to me there, you can be a me poet, but you should also be a we poet. And I thought, that's kind of catchy, but I thought, wow, you know what it is? It's thinking these words are important for me, and some of these poems will just be for me. But maybe my words are important, and maybe they will do something transformative for somebody else. And so I had to go through my own stuff and basically actually talk to my father and say, hey, I wrote this poem about you and about us and about our lives in the Bay Area and about Broken Home and about Black September and about these things. Is that okay to share them? Can you read it? And I think a rule of thumb that has helped me is to think, if my grandmother read this poem about her, would she say, yeah, it's true? هذه صح. She might not like it, it might not be her style, but would she say, yes, this is true? And if she says yes, tamam. And if she doesn't, then I need to write that she wouldn't agree. It's to be true, right? And so I think I want to ask a question of what it means to write for each other. So not to write for a gaze, which you spoke about, Mohammed, an external gaze, what it means as Palestinians to write narratives for one another and for our own struggle. But I also want to uplift some of the questions. We have amazing questions. So first is from Dana. As a Palestinian, I feel like our work can be taken and used so ambiguously and so impersonally. How did you find a way to publish your work but still keep it your own? And she also asks, what are some struggles that you think are specific to younger Palestinian authors? Is time passing a tool or a disadvantage? I know we've talked about this a little bit, but I wanted to float those two questions. And then I'll pair in one more, if that's all right. So Mohammed, there's one specifically for you from Amal. And Amal writes, Mohammed, can you elaborate on writing that is not weakening or designed to make us acceptable? I think a lot of our writing and activism, including our leaders and their negotiating skills, seem to be about making our narrative acceptable, our demands acceptable, etc. Personally, I think we haven't asserted our narrative in a way that makes us whole again. When I look at the nationalist movements of, say, India or South Africa, they were unashamed to assert their whole narrative and demands. I don't see the same with Palestine and Palestinians. So maybe you can also comment on that.
Thank you, Amal. That is an excellent question. I'm glad you asked. And I feel like by answering it, I'm also going to answer a little bit about how we can write for ourselves as opposed to writing for a gaze, and how we can write unambiguously and still get into places. I think one of the main challenges I faced coming into my writing career as a young poet was persuasive writing, right? As Palestinians, we grew up in a world that has gaslit us into thinking that this so-called conflict we live under is so controversial that we need to constantly be making a case for ourselves. When in truth, just by looking at the situation, there is nothing complex or controversial or conflict-like about what is going on. So I think we need to escape the stagnancy of what I'd like to call the cycle of humanization. We are constantly trying to be didactic and persuasive and talk about the women and children in our families as if they cannot engage in resistance, but also talk about them as if men are the villains in the story. We are constantly emphasizing that not only Israel is killing people in wheelchairs, right? For example, I'm getting thrown out of my home, and that is not enough. I have to say that I'm getting thrown out of my home and my father is in his 70s and my little sister has a panic disorder, because I need some kind of empathy collecting from the audience. When in fact, our cause and our plea for justice is righteous. There is nothing ambiguous about this righteousness. And we owe it to ourselves to write about us and about our community members and about our family members in complex ways. When I write about my grandmother, God rest her soul, when I write about her with so much love and so much respect and so much dignity, I also include her flaws, because that is what makes a good character and that is what makes a human character. humanization so often does exactly the opposite of what it alleges. Yani by flattening ourselves, by constantly portraying ourselves as victims, as people who are weakened, as people who are like helpless, which is true, we are victims and we don't have the resources and the means that the colonizers do. But on the same hand, we are a people who are oppressed and we want dignity. We are people who can speak for ourselves. We are people that can understand and endure this oppression and still smile and have fun at the end of the day. It is killing us to have to constantly portray ourselves in shrunken ways and constantly portray ourselves in flat and victimized ways. So that is how I think. I agree with Amal a lot, because other liberation movements, let me say this in a different way. We have, like, our liberation movement has been kind of bullied by mainstream media in English-speaking countries to make our demands benignly like non-harmful. صح? And I think the demands of the Palestinian people right now in the mainstream eye are the bare minimum, and they still won't give it to us. So we need to go full throttle and say exactly what we want. Yani, the only thing the Palestinian people have left is dignity, is self-respect. And we need to fortify that instead of flattening ourselves. We need to speak about ourselves in the first person and assertive verbs and adjectives. I'm speaking linguistically as well, not just in terms of the narrative we tell. We also need to hold ourselves very, very strong and grounded and rooted into our, we need to be certain of ourselves, because even for me, and I don't want to drift too far, but for me, speaking about this position in Jerusalem, for example, oftentimes feels like this is not urgent. People are losing their homes. I mean, people are getting their homes demolished. Some people are getting it worse. Some people are getting killed. Some people are in administrative detention. But it's this hierarchy of oppression that Israel has created for us that has manipulated us into thinking that this tragedy that I'm living is okay because it's not as bad as that tragedy that my neighbor is living in. When in fact, we need to reject all of these things and not compromise at all, because it's not about how many victims colonialism produces. It's about colonialism as a concept that needs to be stopped. And if we only continue to address the victims and continue to shift people's gazes to the children sleeping on the street and the limbless men and all of that, we can garner sympathy, sure. But unless we address the colonizer directly, unless we address the Israeli settler colonial project and all of historical Palestine directly, we cannot make any movements. As long as there's a dehumanizer, there's going to be dehumanized. Yeah, sorry, I got really heated. Shit.
Yeah, the chat is like going off.
Yeah, that was amazing, Mohammed. Thank you for, saying all that. I mean, literally go the fuck off. As someone just said. And I'm just thinking, like, just going back to, I think what we see is like, what I see as the purpose of writing, and as like, as we're saying, like architects of our narrative, but like how much that has been diluted, or how much like the power of writing has been kind of like confined into this, like what you're saying is just like trying to articulate the conditions or trying to like defend our humanity, and how much of that, like the power and energy of writing, like its potential to create and to envision and to kind of like organize and believe and enact kind of freedom and liberation, like that power of writing, how much it has been kind of diverted and like put into kind of us just defending our humanity. And I feel like that's what I'm thinking of, is just how sorry, I'm just getting distracted by the chat. We are beautiful. But yeah, and just how much that has been I feel like that's just really like, just thinking about how writing, I feel like, is such an important weapon for us, for our struggle. And I feel like this kind of like relegating our writing into, or making it so that we are kind of just like stuck in, or like defending our reality, or having to dilute it or sanitize it. You know, like I was also just told when I was performing in an event that like I should that I shouldn't perform one of my poems because it might not be receptive, like the audience might not be receptive to it. And I was like, I am not writing for what your audience is receptive or not, you know. I'm writing for myself, I'm writing for my people, and I am not gonna like, yeah. And so then I ended up performing that poem, but I feel like that happens a lot, where it's like when we used our words, when we use writing for that, the purpose that it is for, you know, to confront people with the reality, to really like use it as something to envision and enact decolonization, you know, it is a weapon, it is a militant tool for us, right? When we are denied so many other ways of struggling, but I feel like that it is really like a way that colonization has diluted and made this tool not as powerful as it can be, and that it is for us to be. That's what I was thinking of when you were talking, is just how I feel like the power of writing to create and architect and construct worlds and realities, that has been removed from it for us as Palestinians, because it is then kind of, we're using it to like defend our humanity, or to, which is still important, I mean, to define our reality. But yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. But I wanted to address one more. Oh, yes. I think I wanted to kind of address, Nadya, your question about writing for the collective very quickly. I think, so that Maysam can speak, but I think that that for me, at least, I think for the past few years since I started performing and writing my poetry, that it's kind of become that I'm like writing my poetry and writing my words for events or for protests or for rallies or for like these audiences and these things. And I think for so long before that, poetry I had just kind of written for me, and written for, you know, to kind of understand myself, my feelings, my place in the world. And I feel like there was such a dramatic shift for it to change into kind of this thing that I was like constantly sharing, and writing for other people and writing for, you know, these like events. And I feel like it became, I felt very, at that point, like I kind of felt very disconnected from my words and very, very disconnected from my poetry, because I felt like, I think for me, like, as I'm coming to the understanding that words and writing is a way for me to kind of like understand myself, to kind of narrate my individual experience, my unique experience, to understand my own place, and then to share that with the world, and for it to be a part of that, to be a part of our collective narrative, to be part of our collective, you know, and in service of our struggle. And I feel like, so I feel like for me, I want to find a balance between, you know, using poetry as a way of self-reflection, and as a way to articulate my personal story, and then also sharing that and having it be part of the collective. Because I feel like for a long time, I stopped writing because I felt so disconnected from my words. I felt like I couldn't write unless it was like someone had asked me to write for a protest or for an event. And I felt very like, it felt like I would read back at these poems that I had written and performed many times, and I felt like I didn't write them. I felt like I lost kind of my ownership over them. And not that ownership is like, but I feel like I want to find that balance between like sharing my poetry, having it be part of the collective, and then also using it still to kind of articulate my own personal journey. But yeah, I give it to you, Maysam.
Wow, thank you so much. I've been taking notes from the things everyone has been saying on this panel, because I feel like as much as I am a participant here, I'm still learning so much from all three of you. And I just want to say thank you for real. Like I still feel very young in my own writing and young just in general. And so I am so grateful to be able to be in conversation with other Palestinian writers and creators and organizers at this point in my life. And I guess that would go into kind of one of the questions about advice for young writers. But first I'll address kind of writing for the collective. And I think just, I don't know currently how to build off of the things that Mohammed al-Kurd and Voulette have said today with regards to, you know, how do we, you know, stop flattening our narratives? How do we write complex characters? How do we, you know, write for ourselves, but also write for each other in a way that is, you know, still confrontational and not digestible, like you were saying, V. And I'm very, very similar to you, V, in terms of the fact that most of my writing and most of my poetry has been always shared to a live audience. I've been very kind of protective of the work that I do and only been like, you know, you can only understand it if you hear it from from me in person, you know what I mean? It's different on the page, it's different when I publish it online. It's not, you know, the same, right? We don't have the same experience, but I think, you know, I'm starting to learn beyond that. But I think there is so much power to, you know, poetry and writing in tandem with organizing. And I think in many ways, when you put the two together, you're at least in the Palestinian movement, we are writing for each other. And like you, V, I also wrote a lot for protests and rallies, and listening to one of my favorite spoken word artists, Elle Jones. I don't know if any of you have heard of her, but I saw her perform once at my university, and she did the whole, it was like a presentation, but she did the whole thing through her poetry. So she was interweaving all these different poems as one whole narrative for like an hour, and it was just insane to me. And anyway, she talks about, you know, when she writes, sometimes it doesn't even matter too much what the words are. Sometimes it's just, you know, when you are performing it, at least in the spoken word context, how does it making those people feel in the moment, right? Because it leaves you at a certain point, you're just a medium for those words, right? To come out and to reach your audience. And, you know, sometimes I look at myself that way, as just the medium for these stories. I feel like, you know, I've just been the person who's done the work of unearthing some stories, but these stories have always had a spirit of their own. I know that sounds, you know, a little abstract, but sometimes I truly don't feel too much of an ownership over some of the things I've written, because my process has been so stream of consciousness as well. And actually my process is that I'll stream of consciously write something and then orally say it to myself. And if it doesn't sound right when I say it, I'll fix it. But usually it's mostly connected to how I say what I've written, if that makes sense. And so it really just feels like it's something, you know, coming through you. But once it leaves me, it doesn't feel like I own it anymore. It doesn't feel like Maysam wrote this. It feels like this is a story about Palestine. This is a story about my mother. This is a story about the land. This is a story about community. This is a story about love and rage. This is, you know, all these human stories that we know. And so I don't know. I think, like you said, Nadya, we are not individuals in this. And as writers, like we are not, you know, I don't necessarily think I'm crafting anything necessarily new or unique all the time. I think I'm just a conduit for things that are already kind of there, if that makes sense. I don't know. But then I guess I would say for for young writers like me who feel young in their writing, who feel, you know, a type of imposter syndrome within literature, who feel, you know, all these different, you know, types of, I guess like an inferiority in writing, I would say find community, find people who write, find other young Palestinians. For the longest time, I was not connected to community, and PYM was an avenue for that for me. Organizing on campus was an avenue for that for me as well. And that's how I actually started my writing, through that organizing, through that community. So I would say find other writers. This year I had the great opportunity to help facilitate a workshop with PYM and the Ghassan Kanafani Scholarship Committee. We did a workshop for young Palestinian writers over Zoom, obviously. But I just remember during that workshop, all the participants were just craving a space to be in, and a space where, you know, certain, you know, experiences of being Palestinian and being a child of diaspora were just understood without having to be explained in depth. I know for myself, I never thought that I could perform for anyone else but Palestinian audiences, because I didn't think, you know, well, not just Palestinian audiences, but anyone of any diaspora. I didn't think, you know, white people, for instance, could understand my words either. But I think, anyway, you know, that doesn't matter. I think just, you know, finding that community, finding a space, finding a place to you know, read your work and check in with each other is really important. And then I wanted to mention something Nadya was saying, you know, like checking in with our loved ones to ensure that we have, you know, the permission to write those stories. I think that's a part of also writing for each other. Initially, that first piece that I got published in the anthology, I hadn't read to anybody else except for my mom. And I remember being so nervous to read this poem to my mom. She's always like, you know, she's just, you know, like our mothers. But I remember just coming with my poem and reading it to her and getting emotional. And, you know, I was very, you know, the rage was there, whatever. And my mom's initial response was just like, wow, that was actually very good. No tears, no, wow, mashallah, habibti, I'm so proud, nothing, just, wow, that was actually good. Like, I'm surprised that you could actually pull something off like that. And so that was me taking her blessings and, you know, finally sharing it with the world. But yeah, I told myself that I wouldn't publish anything about my mom without checking in with her first. And so that's something that I'm proud of myself for staying true to. And I haven't, you know, published too much, but I think, you know, your approval and your loved ones' approval and the people that you're writing for is all that matters at the end of the day. You know, you don't need to be published. I think it's a little bit about that. Anyway, sorry, that was very long-winded again, but yeah, thank you so much, Nadya. I'll pass it to you.
Nobody is upset about the long-windedness in the process. It's true what somebody wrote in the chat. You were very poetic, even in your speaking now, Maysam. I can say the same for each of you. It really, gosh, there's just so much. I love what you said about how the words are. Sometimes it's not even that important, but the words are. They live. They have their own spirit. And I love what you said also about the idea of, you know, they are our stories. And Sara, I think in the chat wrote, you know, the process of honoring your own story before you share it with the collective and going through your own process. And I think, you know, it's just part of what each of us needs to be genuine in telling that, you know. Kaman, I've been lucky to come from a family that's very strong, and where I can ask and I can say, okay, takes so much courage, but what do you think? As you were speaking, I also thought of Palestinian youth who I work with, who I build with, who don't come from a strong family backing, how do you tell those stories when a lot of your kinships are broken, which you also spoke about, Maysam. And I think on some level, it's that same balance of knowing how we ask, not permission, but how we, ask the things that need to be answered, and when we can move on and have enough courage, have the courage and have enough, I think, self-belief and a reassurance that it's okay to experiment. It's also okay to make mistakes, because there will always be a teaching and a lesson, and I think, and an experience, I think that's also the power of the collective. Inshallah, we are not judgmental in order to harm or to stop or to halt or to shrink, right? Hopefully we're there to support in a way where you don't have to go off just one by yourself where you're super vulnerable. You can be vulnerable with us, with one another. And I think, I know we have about 5 more minutes before we transition, but I just wanted to ask one more question of each of you, maybe like a 1-minute answer. How are your creations part of a collective road home? What does it mean? What do these messages mean? What are we offering? If you could offer, you've offered so much, like there's so much to pull through, but if we're talking about building a road home, building a road to liberation, think about like one of the stones or one of the steps on the road. Like, which one would you highlight?
Excellent question. I'll answer briefly. I think what really helps me think about this is saying to myself that liberated people are not bowed head. That's what I think, if we're going to be a liberated people, we have to, once again, we have to hold ourselves in a very high regard, and we have to have self-respect. I write as a person. I write as part of the collective after having engulfed myself with Palestinian resistant literature, with the likes of Ghassan Kanafani and Rashid Hussein and so on. I think it's important to understand the tone and the vocabulary that those before us have chosen. And also it's important to be very critical of it. So we can appreciate what the writers before us have written for the collective, and we can also look at some of it and say, no, actually, I don't think this fits right now. Maybe 40 years when Palestine was an enigma, sure, you could talk about it this way, but today, not really. So I think writing for the collective is, in order to write for the collective, you have to be completely in tune with what is going on the ground and all of the grassroots efforts that Palestinians are pulling off in historical Palestine. And I say historical Palestine, I'm saying Palestine 1948, before Israel even was a thing, and then Palestinians in the Palestinian diaspora. And when I say this, I'm not even talking about poetry books or literature. I'm talking about like the actual on the ground people working locally across different platforms. You have to be engulfed and immerse yourself in Palestinian society to understand what the Palestinian street demands. That is how you write for the collective. You don't pull it out of your ass. You pull it out of the collective. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that.
I think when you ask this question, Nadya, I think I'm thinking just about my grandmother, and kind of, I think it relates to the other question you said too. But so I wrote a poem. I'm named after my grandmother. Voulette is my grandmother's name. And so I wrote a poem that's about her and her name. And then I shared it with my family. And that was one of the first poems I shared with my family. And they translated it into Arabic. And then they kind of put it on like this frame thing, and with a picture of my grandmother, and they gave her that poem, my poem, translated into Arabic, and like a picture of her to her for Eid al-Umm, or Mother's Day, a few years ago, I think like around 2 or 3 years ago. And my grandmother doesn't read. So there's a video of them like reading out the poem in Arabic to her. And so when I think about how I see my writing as part of a collective road home, you know, that as I am able and have been back to Palestine, been back to where my grandmother's home is from, and she has never been there after 73 years. And that as, you know, still this degrees of separation between my grandparents, my parents, me and Palestine, just continuing on those stories and bringing them back, and having that video of her reading it and like knowing that like my poem about her, about Palestine, about Nakba, about us kind of renaming ourselves together, and is like sitting like in Marka in Amman in Jordan where she lives now, like in her bedroom where she sleeps, like makes me feel, that's what I think about how I see this as my writing as a part of that collective road home.
Thank you so much, Bea and Mohammed and Nadya. My writing is a part of a collective road home. I think that's a question that I'm gonna try to answer for probably the rest of my life as I continue to write. And until we see a free Palestine, until my mother can finally see a free Palestine, until we can finally step foot on that land. But I think currently, similar to V, I think, you know, being able to present our family with those small little snippets of who we are. One of my poems that's in this year's anthology, Tete Loves Pomegranates, literally was just inspired by just the way that my grandma left Palestine when she was young, when she was around 8 years old, and would always talk about just kind of the luxury of fruits being so such a like hard thing to come by. So oranges, pomegranates, etc. And because we're from north of Palestine, and oranges are kind of, you know, citrus fruits are kind of what we're known for, or we're known for. I've just felt an affinity to that image, and so just watching my grandma just hold a pomegranate and hold it so like it's a piece of gold, you know. It was just an image that will be burnt into my brain for the rest of my life. So to be able to reflect that back in my writing, back to my grandma, so that she can see it, is probably what I can offer right now. Because I guess the road to home for me on a personal level, because, you know, we can't always do it on the big scale, is I guess the road to home for my grandma, for my mom, for my loved ones in my community in an indirect sense. But then anyone who reads that piece and feels seen and feels any way bit connected to that fruit, or connected to that little trace of what home feels, and feels witnessed in that, I think is what I can offer in terms of currently in our collective road home, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Oh, thank you all so much.
Can I say something really fast?
Tfaddal.
My sister and my dad are watching me from Jerusalem, so I just want to say marhaba.
Hi, loved ones. Thank you all so much for this session and for your heart. And thank you to all the folks who are attending for your engagement. It really makes me feel, I think it makes us feel like we're in a room and really have just a conduit of energy, even as we're sitting in different places. So thank you. Please follow up with the panelists. You know, please follow up with us. We'd love to hear from you. And also please enjoy our work. It's downloadable. I know Aya sent a message that it's all available now. And actually, before we finish, we have some really exciting news.
Yes, everyone, please stay on, because we'd like to present the Palestine Writes Emerging Writer Award to Mohammed al-Kurd, who has actually a book coming out soon. So this award comes with a $1,000 gift to Mohammed al-Kurd, who was chosen by a panel of his peers from the Palestine Youth Movement. The prize is funded by Palestine Writes and the Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies at NYU. We hope that this award can be an annual event that we can do in collaboration with Palestine Youth Movement, whose work we greatly admire. So thank you so much for your words and your work, Mohammed. We're so thrilled to give this award. And I know Nadya would like to share some comments on why you were selected for this wonderful award.
Very briefly, as the Ghassan Kanafani committee, we pulled from over We pulled from over 160 writers. We took specifically those who had submitted multiple times to the anthology, had really blossomed in the process, but had never won the anthology award. And from that, we collectively selected you because we think that you're somebody who speaks to your personal experience and your truth. And you also speak to our political condition. You are somebody who writes for us. You have an amazing body of work already as a young writer, and we expect so much from you. We are excited to be part of the journey and to see you grow and to be informed and to connect, continue to build together. We really believe in your work. We really believe in the message that you put out, and we're really, really proud of you. And so we wanted collectively to honor you with this award. And thank you really to Pal Writes for making this possible. You all have done a splendid job, and you really set this up for young writers. It's, yeah, thank you. I want to acknowledge the work of the Kevorkian Center and also Palestine Writes in putting this together.
Oh my God, thank you so much. It's an incredible honor. Thank you to PYM, JK, GK Scholarship, and thank you to Palestine Writes, of course. And you know, it's an honor in and of itself to be on this panel and a part of this amazing festival to begin with, but to be honored by my own peers and community and writing, you know, peers is amazing. I don't know what to say right now, but I'm very, very grateful and I'm very honored. And I think I'm only, like, all of my writing is but an attempt to write about the collective and to write about the Palestinian experience in a way that is dignified, complex, and respectful to the people I come from and where we are today. So again, thank you so much. عن جد I am شكرا كتير 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 شكرا. أنا كل شرف وكل شكر يعني شكرا عن جد. شكرا.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here, to all of our panelists, for such a wonderful panel and for really giving us, you know, a peek into our future. So thank you. And thank you, Nadya, for moderating such a lovely panel. Before we leave, I just want to say that for everyone, the file is actually downloadable now. So we just re-uploaded it. The first page will be the GK donation brochure. If you'd like to support the GK scholarship in the future, you can follow those instructions. You can see where you can submit yourself, as well as some more information about the GK Scholarship, which is a window for so many Palestinian writers, including myself actually, into Palestinian literature. And then also I would really like to emphasize that PYM also has a booth at the festival. And so I'm not sure if you guys know, but if you go on to the top of the lobby area, there'll be a section that says, the Akka, I think, area, and then you can go underneath that. It says vendors, and it also says booths. So you can click on there and visit our vendors, our booths. I would like to plug that you also visit our bookshop, because that's how you can keep Palestine Writes going, as well as our shop. So please click around the festival, enjoy everything that's there, and take pictures and post them to whatever social media you use with the hashtag Palestine Writes. We would love to share them. So thank you again for being here, and thank you to our panelists. Have a wonderful rest of your Palestine Writes Festival.
Thank you, Aya. Thank you, everybody.
Mabruk, Mohammed.
Oh my God.
Thank you. Mabruk, Mohammed.
Thank you.
So proud.
Thank you. Oh my God.
MashaAllah.